In 1824, a successful black barber in New Haven, Connecticut, received the worst news of his life. After 8 years of freedom, after building a thriving business near Yale's campus, after purchasing property and achieving what seemed impossible, a man walked into his shop and recognized him. Within weeks, William Grimes would lose everything he'd built. His property, his possessions, his savings, all gone. He'd be forced to pay $500, the equivalent of $13,000 today, to purchase something he thought he already had. But here's what makes his story extraordinary. This wasn't the end of William Grimes. It was the beginning of something that would change American literature forever. Because what he did next, how he fought back, would make him the first person in American history to do something that had never been done before. But how does someone who's been robbed of everything twice, first by slavery and then by legal extortion, transform that loss into a weapon that would help dismantle the very system that enslaved him? Stay until the end. The answer reveals a strategy so powerful that it's still changing lives today, more than 200 years later. To understand what William Grimes became, you have to understand where he started. King George County, Virginia, 1784. The year William was born, his mother was enslaved on a plantation, and his father was the plantation owner next door. Benjamin Grimes, Jr., a wealthy white man who would never acknowledge his son. William came into this world already marked by the fundamental contradiction of American slavery. His father owned land, owned people, owned power. His mother owned nothing, not even herself, not even her own child. Think about what that means for a moment. From his first breath, William existed in a space that shouldn't have been possible, the son of the master and the enslaved. Too white to be fully black in the eyes of some, too black to ever be free in the eyes of the law. This wasn't just about skin color. It was about a system that needed to draw absolute lines, and William Grimes was born right on that line, belonging nowhere, claimed by a world that would spend the next 30 years trying to break him. For the first 10 years of his life, William lived on or near his father's plantation. We don't know if his father ever spoke to him, ever acknowledged him, ever looked at him and saw a son instead of property. What we do know is that in 1794, when William was 10 years old, everything changed. He was sold, taken from his mother, from everything he'd ever known, and sent to a distant plantation. 10 years old. Imagine being 10 and watching your mother disappear, knowing you'll probably never see her again, knowing that the man who could stop this with a single word, your own father, won't say that word, won't even try. This was William's first lesson in what slavery really meant. It wasn't just about work or hardship, it was about the systematic destruction of every human bond, every connection that might give you strength or hope. Because enslaved people who loved each other, who had families, who had reasons to live beyond survival, those people were dangerous. They might resist, they might run, they might remember they were human beings. Over the next 20 years, William would be sold again and again. 10 different masters across 3 states, Virginia, Maryland, Georgia. Each sale was another severing, another reminder that he wasn't a person with a life. He was a thing that could be moved, traded, used up. He worked as a house servant, a valet, a field worker, a stable boy. Whatever they needed, that's what he became. And with each new master came a new set of rules, a new personality to navigate, a new kind of danger. Let me tell you about some of these masters, because understanding what William endured helps you understand the strength it took to survive. One master in Virginia, William would later write, was very fond of him and always treated him kindly. This master would give him extra food sometimes, would speak to him with something approaching respect. But that master's wife was a different story. She would beat William until he could barely stand, using whatever was at hand. A stick, a strap, her fists. The bruises would layer on top of bruises, new injuries before old ones could heal. You see the trap? Even kindness in slavery was conditional, temporary, meaningless, because kindness from a master doesn't change the fact that you're enslaved. It just makes the cruelty more confusing, more unpredictable. You couldn't trust anything, not kindness, not routine, not even your own ability to stay safe by being good, by working hard, by doing everything right. Another master in Maryland worked William from before sunrise until after dark. Field work, the kind that breaks your back and your spirit. William wasn't used to field work. He'd been trained as a house servant, had learned skills like barbering and serving. But this master didn't care about William's skills or his previous training. He needed field hands, so William became a field hand. His hands, which had been trained to hold razors and scissors with precision, now gripped hoes and axes. His back, which had been straight and strong, began to curve from the endless bending and lifting. And every night, William would collapse onto his pallet, too exhausted to even think about escape, too broken to imagine a different life. Then there was the master in Georgia, the one who would beat William for the smallest infractions, a tool left in the wrong place, a task completed too slowly, a look that seemed too direct, too proud. This master seemed to take pleasure in the violence, seemed to enjoy watching William flinch, watching him try to protect himself, watching him fail. The physical abuse was constant. William endured beatings from masters, from overseers, even from other enslaved people who'd been so broken by the system that they turned on each other. His body carried the marks of this violence, scars that would never fade, injuries that would ache for the rest of his life. But here's what's important. Through all of this, through 20 years of being passed from master to master like a piece of furniture, William was learning. He was watching. He was understanding something that would eventually save his life. He learned which masters were predictable and which were volatile. He learned how to read white people's moods, how to anticipate their needs, how to make himself valuable enough to avoid the worst punishments. He learned the geography of the South, the routes between plantations, the locations of towns and rivers. He learned which enslaved people could be trusted and which ones would betray you to curry favor with the master. He learned that the system that enslaved him was built on lies. Lies about who was human and who wasn't. Lies about who deserved freedom and who deserved chains. Lies about what black people were capable of. And if the whole thing was built on lies, then maybe, just maybe, there was a way out. But the physical pain was almost easier to bear than the psychological torture, the uncertainty, the knowledge that everything could change in an instant, that you could be sold tomorrow, beaten tonight, separated from everyone you loved on a master's whim. William watched other enslaved people around him give up. He watched them stop fighting, stop hoping, stop believing that anything could ever be different. He watched them become what the masters wanted them to be, docile, obedient, broken. And William made a choice. He wouldn't become that. By 1814, William Grimes was 30 years old. He'd spent his entire life enslaved, passed between 10 different masters like a tool that kept changing hands. He was in Savannah, Georgia, working for yet another master, and something inside him broke. Not in a way that destroyed him, but in a way that freed him. He'd had enough. The unhappiness, the unkindness, the serious physical abuse, it had all reached a point where he realized something crucial. He had no choice but to try to escape. Because staying meant dying, maybe not physically, but dying in every way that mattered. So William made a plan. And this is where you start to see the intelligence, the courage, the sheer determination that would define the rest of his life. He didn't just run. Running got you caught. Running got you killed. Instead, William found a ship bound for New York, and he hid himself in an empty carton barrel. Can you imagine that? Climbing into a barrel, pulling the lid over yourself, and waiting in the darkness while the ship prepared to sail. The barrel was cramped, barely big enough for a grown man to fit inside. William had to curl his body into an impossible position, his knees pressed against his chest, his head bent forward. He couldn't move. He could barely breathe. The air inside the barrel was thick and stale, and as the hours passed, it became harder and harder to draw breath. He didn't know if he'd be discovered. Every footstep on the deck above him sent his heart racing. Every voice made him freeze, certain that someone had found him, that his escape was over before it began. He didn't know if he'd suffocate. As the air grew thinner, as his lungs struggled to find oxygen, William wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake. If he'd die in this barrel, his body discovered days later when the ship reached port. He'd heard it was bound for New York, but he couldn't be certain. It might stop in Charleston or Norfolk or any number of southern ports where he'd be captured immediately. Just knowing that this barrel, this tiny space, was his only chance. The ship sailed. William stayed hidden. Hours turned into days. He had no food, no water. His muscles cramped from the impossible position. His throat was parched. His head pounded from lack of oxygen and dehydration. But he stayed silent. He stayed still. He endured. Because the alternative was unthinkable. And when the ship finally docked in New York, when William heard the sounds of the port and felt the ship come to rest, when he finally pushed open the lid of that barrel and emerged into the light, he was a different person. He was free. From New York, William made his way to New Bedford, Massachusetts. He'd learned barbering during his years of slavery, one of the skills that house servants and valets picked up, and he opened his first barbershop. Think about that transition. One day you're enslaved, your time and labor and body belonging to someone else. The next, you're running your own business, serving customers, earning money that's actually yours. It must have felt impossible, like a dream he might wake up from at any moment. William set up his shop in a small building near the docks. He purchased razors, scissors, a chair, a mirror. Simple tools, but they were his. He put out a sign advertising his services, and slowly customers began to come. Sailors from the ships, dock workers, local merchants. They sat in his chair, and William cut their hair, shaved their faces, and collected payment. Real money that he could keep, that he could use to buy food and clothing and shelter. For the first time in his life, William was working for himself. But New Bedford wasn't the haven William hoped for. Yes, slavery was illegal there, but racism wasn't. And one day, a white woman who lived below his barber shop accused him of raping and beating her. The accusation was false, completely, utterly false. William had never touched this woman, had never even spoken to her beyond basic greetings, but she was white and he was black, and in 1814 that was all that mattered. William was arrested. He was thrown in jail. He faced trial, knowing that his word meant nothing against hers, knowing that he could be convicted and hanged based on nothing but her accusation. The trial was a nightmare. William sat in the courtroom, listening to this woman lie about him, watching the jury's faces as they absorbed her testimony. He had no real defense. He couldn't afford a good lawyer. He couldn't call witnesses who would be believed. All he could do was tell the truth and hope that somehow, impossibly, justice would prevail. And it did. In a town where he was already seen as suspicious, already watched, already judged, this accusation made it impossible to stay. Even though he was innocent, even though the law said so, the racism was too much. People looked at him differently. Customers stopped coming to his shop. He received threats, so William left. He walked away from his first business, his first attempt at building a free life, and headed to Connecticut. He walked 80 miles to New Haven, 80 miles on foot, carrying whatever he could, leaving behind everything else. The walk took days. William slept in fields and forests, ate whatever food he could find or afford, kept moving because stopping meant giving up. His feet blistered, his legs ached. But he kept walking, because New Haven represented a new chance, a new beginning, a place where maybe, just maybe, he could finally build a life that would last. And in New Haven, William Grimes started over. He opened another barber shop, this time on Chapel Street, right near Yale's campus. And this time, it worked. The location was perfect. Yale students needed haircuts and shaves, and William's shop was convenient. But it was more than convenience. William was good at what he did, Really good. His hands were steady and skilled from years of practice. He could give a close shave without nicking the skin. He could cut hair in the latest styles. He could make conversation, put customers at ease, make them feel welcome in his shop. Word spread. Students started coming regularly. They'd sit in William's chair and talk about their classes, their professors, their plans for the future. And William would listen, would engage, would offer his own thoughts when appropriate. These young men, many of them from wealthy families, many of them destined for careers in law and politics and business, they came to respect William, not just as a barber, but as a person, someone intelligent, someone capable, someone worth knowing. The business grew. William was making real money now, more than he'd ever imagined possible. He was saving, planning, thinking about the future. And then he met Clarissa. We don't know exactly how they met, but we know they fell in love. Clarissa saw in William what he'd always known about himself, but what the world had tried to deny, that he was a man worthy of love, worthy of respect, worthy of a future. They got married, and suddenly William had something he'd never had before, a partner. Someone who believed in him, who supported him, who shared his dreams. With Clarissa by his side, William took the next big step. He purchased property, actual property, land and a building that belonged to him, that had his name on the deed. Do you understand what that meant? For someone who'd been property himself, who'd been bought and sold like a piece of furniture, to own property, it was more than economic success. It was a declaration. I am human. I am free. I am here. I matter. The property gave William security. It gave him status in the community. It gave him something to build on, something to pass down. He and Clarissa could imagine a future now. Maybe children, maybe expanding the business, maybe buying more property. The possibilities seemed endless. For the first time in his life, William could plan beyond tomorrow, beyond next week, beyond survival. He could dream. For 8 years, William Grimes lived this life. He built his business, he built his reputation, he built a community. Students from Yale came to his shop, not just for haircuts, but for conversation. They'd discuss politics, philosophy, current events. William became part of the fabric of New Haven, a fixture near the campus, a man who'd made something of himself against impossible odds. He was known. He was respected, he was successful, and maybe, just maybe, William started to believe he was safe, that he'd actually escaped, that his past couldn't reach him here. He was wrong. In April 1824, William was working in Litchfield, Connecticut, barbering for local students when someone recognized him, a friend of Francis Wilman, William's former enslaver from Virginia. This friend had known William years ago, had seen him on Wilman's plantation, and now here he was, free and successful in Connecticut. And just like that, everything changed. The friend contacted Wilman. Wilman came north. And William Grimes, successful businessman, property owner, respected member of his community, was suddenly facing the reality he'd been running from for 8 years. He was still, legally, enslaved. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 made this possible. It allowed slave owners to pursue escaped slaves into free states and reclaim them as property. It required local authorities to assist in the capture and return of fugitive slaves. It meant that William's 8 years of freedom, his business, his marriage, his property, none of it mattered under the law. Francis Wilman had a legal right to William's body, and he intended to exercise that right. Wilman gave him a choice: pay $500 to purchase his freedom, or be taken back to Virginia and re-enslavement. $500. In today's money, about $13,000. William didn't have it. Nobody he knew had it, but Wilman didn't care. He wanted his money, or he wanted his property back. Those were the only options. Think about what this meant. William had escaped slavery. He'd built a free life. He'd done everything right. He'd worked hard, saved money, purchased property, contributed to his community, and now he was being told that none of it mattered. That his freedom, his business, his marriage, his property, all of it could be taken away because of a legal system that still considered him someone else's property. The injustice of it was staggering. But injustice doesn't care about fairness. It just is. William had to find the money. He mortgaged his property, he sold his possessions. Everything he'd accumulated over 8 years of freedom, everything he'd built, he liquidated it, turned it into cash, his furniture, his tools, his savings, everything. And he gave it to Francis Wilman. $500 for something that should have been his by right. $500 for his own body, his own life. Students from the Litchfield Law School helped him navigate the legal process, drawing up the papers, making sure the transaction was official. But there was no getting around the fundamental transaction. William Grimes had to buy himself. The payment plunged William, Clarissa, and their family into bankruptcy. They lost the property. The deed that had meant so much, that had represented William's arrival as a free man, it was gone. They lost their savings. Every dollar William had carefully set aside, every bit of security he'd built, it was gone. They were buried in debt. And William was free again, but this time he understood something he hadn't fully grasped before. Freedom in America, for a black man, wasn't something you achieved once. It was something you had to fight for every single day. It could be taken from you at any moment, for any reason, by anyone with the power and the will to take it. Most people, facing that kind of loss, that kind of injustice, would have been destroyed. They would have given up, accepted that the system was too big, too powerful, too entrenched to fight. But William Grimes wasn't most people, and what he did next would change everything. If this story of turning devastating loss into revolutionary action inspires you, share this video to help others discover how one man's refusal to stay silent became the foundation for an entire movement. In 1825, 1 year after being forced to purchase his freedom, William Grimes did something that had never been done before in American history. He sat down and wrote his story. Not just the facts, not just a timeline, but the whole truth. The brutality of slavery, the violence, the separations, the dehumanization, the escape, the false accusation, the extortion, all of it. And then he published it. He called it Life of William Grimes, the Runaway Slave, written by himself. Written by himself. Those 3 words were revolutionary. Because enslaved people weren't supposed to be able to write. They weren't supposed to be literate, articulate, capable of telling their own stories. The entire system of slavery depended on the lie that black people were somehow less than human, less capable, less intelligent. And here was William Grimes, publishing a book that proved every single one of those lies wrong. This wasn't just a book, it was a weapon. The first fugitive slave narrative ever published in the United States. The first time a formerly enslaved person from the South had written and published their own account of slavery's horrors. Frederick Douglass wouldn't publish his famous narrative for another 20 years. Harriet Jacobs wouldn't publish hers for 36 years. William Grimes was first. He created the template, the structure, the genre itself. Enslavement, escape, freedom. The transformation story that would become the backbone of the abolitionist movement. But here's what makes it even more remarkable. William didn't write this book from a position of safety or comfort. He didn't write it years later, after achieving security, after the danger had passed. He wrote it while he was still in debt, while he was still vulnerable, while he was still living in a country where the Fugitive Slave Act meant he could be captured and returned to slavery at any moment. He wrote it because he needed the money. He sold the book to pay off the debts from purchasing his freedom. Think about that. The system stole everything from him twice, first through slavery, then through legal extortion. And William's response was to turn his story into a commodity that he controlled. He took the most painful experiences of his life, the trauma and suffering and loss, and he transformed them into something that could generate income, yes, but also something that could change minds. Something that could make people in the North understand what slavery really was. Not an abstract political issue, but a human catastrophe happening to real people with names and faces and stories. The book was powerful because it was honest. William didn't soften the truth. He didn't make slavery more palatable for white readers. He told them about the beatings, the starvation, the filth, the psychological torture. He told them about masters who were kind one moment and cruel the next. He told them about being sold away from his mother at 10 years old. He told them about hiding in a barrel to escape. He told them about the false rape accusation in New Bedford. He told them about being extorted by his former enslaver. He told them everything. In his own words from the 1825 narrative, William described the conditions of his enslavement with unflinching clarity. He wrote about the physical abuse, the inadequate food and clothing, the constant fear. He wrote about watching other enslaved people be beaten until they couldn't stand. He wrote about the psychological warfare of never knowing when you might be sold, when your family might be torn apart, when your life might change in an instant. His prose was direct, unadorned, powerful. He wasn't trying to be literary. He was trying to tell the truth. And people read it. Northern readers who'd never seen slavery up close, who'd maybe heard about it but didn't really understand it, they read William's words and they couldn't dismiss it as abolitionist propaganda. This was first-hand testimony. This was a man saying, "This happened to me. These are my scars. This is my truth." You can't argue with that. You can't explain it away. The narrative also did something else that was crucial. It showed that racism wasn't just a Southern problem. William documented his experiences in the North, the false accusation in New Bedford, the constant suspicion, the way he was never truly safe, never truly accepted, even in a free state. He was showing Northern readers that they were complicit too, that the system of racial oppression extended beyond the Mason-Dixon line, that freedom for black people in America was always conditional, always precarious, always under threat. William's book established a new literary genre, but more than that, it established a new way of thinking about slavery and freedom. It gave agency and voice directly to an enslaved person. It said, "We don't need white intermediaries to tell our stories. We can tell them ourselves. We are intelligent, articulate, capable human beings who deserve to be heard." And that message, that assertion of humanity and capability, was as threatening to the system of slavery as any political speech or legal argument. The book sold. William paid off his debts. And he kept working. He kept running his barber shop on Chapel Street. He kept serving Yale students. He kept building his life, one day at a time, in a country that didn't want him to succeed. But he'd done something that couldn't be undone. He'd created a record, a testimony, a piece of evidence that would outlast him, that would speak to future generations, that would become part of the historical record in a way that slavery tried to prevent. Because that's what slavery did. It tried to erase people. It tried to make them disappear, to reduce them to numbers in a ledger, to strip away their names and stories and humanity. And William Grimes refused to be erased. He wrote himself into history. He claimed his story. He said, "I was here. I mattered. What happened to me was real and wrong and important, and you're going to remember me." Over the next 30 years, William continued living in New Haven. He continued working as a barber. He and Clarissa built a life together, despite the poverty, despite the ongoing racism, despite everything. Their marriage became a testament to resilience. Clarissa stood by William through the bankruptcy, through the debt, through the constant struggle to rebuild what had been taken. She worked alongside him, managing the household, contributing to their survival, providing the emotional support that allowed William to keep fighting. Their partnership was its own form of resistance. Because slavery had tried to destroy black families, had tried to make lasting relationships impossible. And William and Clarissa said no. We're going to build a family. We're going to stay together. We're going to create something that endures. The Yale students who continued to patronize William's shop played an important role in his survival and success. These young men, many from privileged backgrounds, could have gone anywhere for their haircuts. But they chose William's shop. They sat in his chair and listened to his stories. Some of them had read his narrative. Some of them asked him questions about his experiences. And through these interactions, William was changing minds, one person at a time. These students would graduate and become lawyers, judges, politicians, ministers. And they would carry with them the memory of William Grimes, the formerly enslaved barber who'd written a book, who'd survived impossible odds, who'd proven through his daily life that black people deserved freedom and respect. William's success as a barber and entrepreneur, despite everything, was its own form of resistance. Every day he opened his shop, every customer he served, every dollar he earned, he was proving that black people could succeed if given the chance. He was demonstrating competence, intelligence, business acumen, all the things that racist ideology said black people didn't have. He was living proof that the lies were lies. And in 1855, 30 years after publishing his first narrative, William published a second edition. This one included the complete original text plus additional material, new stories from his later life. Some humorous anecdotes about his experiences as a barber, a perspective that had evolved over 3 decades of sustained freedom. The 1855 edition showed something important. William had survived. He'd maintained his freedom for 30 years after that forced purchase. He'd outlasted Francis Wilman. He'd outlasted the immediate danger. And he'd tempered some of his earlier bitterness, not because the injustice was any less real, but because he'd found a way to live with it, to build a life despite it, to find moments of joy and humor even in the midst of ongoing struggle. But William never forgot. He never pretended that everything was fine. The second edition still contained all the brutal truth of the first. He just added to it. He expanded the record. He said, "Here's what happened next. Here's how I survived. Here's what I learned." And by publishing that second edition, he was re-entering the literary marketplace, reminding a new generation of readers that his story mattered, that the fight for true freedom and equality wasn't over. The second edition also revealed something about William's character. After 30 years of freedom, after decades of running his business and building his life, he could have simply let the first edition stand. He could have moved on, focused on his present rather than his past. But he chose to revisit his story, to update it, to ensure that his testimony remained available to readers. This wasn't about money anymore. This was about legacy. This was about making sure that future generations would know what slavery had been, what it had done to people, why it had to be abolished. William's property ownership, even though he lost it in the forced freedom purchase, was significant. For a formerly enslaved person to own property in the 1820s was extraordinary. It showed that he understood how wealth was built in America: land, real estate, tangible assets. He wasn't just surviving day to day. He was planning for the future. He was building something that could be passed down, that could provide security. And when that was taken from him, when he was forced to surrender the deed to his property as part of the extortion, it was another theft, another reminder that the system would always find a way to take from black people what they'd rightfully earned. But William rebuilt. He didn't have property anymore, but he had his business. He had his skills. He had his reputation. He had his story. And he had something else that couldn't be taken from him. He had the knowledge that he'd survived, that he'd escaped slavery, built a free life, been forced to buy himself, lost everything, and still kept going. That kind of resilience, that kind of determination, it's not something you're born with. It's something you forge through suffering and struggle and refusing to give up. The fact that William lived until 1865 is significant. He died the same year the Civil War ended, the same year the 13th Amendment abolished slavery. He lived to see the system that had enslaved him, that had stolen his childhood and his mother, and 30 years of his life, he lived to see it destroyed. We don't know if he knew, in those final days, that slavery was ending. We don't know if he understood that the war he'd been fighting his entire life, the war for freedom and dignity and recognition of his humanity, that it was finally being won. But he must have known that his contribution mattered. His narrative, published 40 years earlier, had been part of the foundation. It had been one of the first voices saying, "This is what slavery really is. This is what it does to people. This is why it has to end." And thousands of people had read his words. Thousands of people had been moved by his story. Thousands of people had their minds changed, their hearts opened, their understanding deepened, because William Grimes had the courage to write his truth. When William died on August 20, 1865, he died in poverty. He was still working as a barber, still running his shop near Yale, still serving customers at age 81. He never regained the economic security he'd had before the forced freedom purchase. He never got back what was stolen from him. But he died free. He died with his name on a book that would outlast him. He died knowing that he'd told his story, that he'd refused to be erased, that he'd fought back in the most powerful way he knew how. His burial at Grove Street Cemetery next to Clarissa was documented. His grave was mapped. His story was preserved. And over the years, historians and researchers and descendants kept his memory alive. Regina Mason, identified as a Grimes descendant, became a leading authority on his life. The Litchfield Historical Society created a series called Think What I Have Felt, commemorating William's life. His narrative was republished in 2008, ensuring that new generations could read his words. According to contemporary historians, William's narrative influenced the development of African-American autobiography and provided crucial first-hand documentation of slavery's realities that helped fuel the abolitionist movement. Remember that question from the beginning. How does someone who's been robbed of everything twice transform that loss into a weapon that would help dismantle the system that enslaved him? Here's the answer. William Grimes understood something that his oppressors didn't. He understood that stories have power, that testimony has power, that the truth, when spoken clearly and courageously, can change the world. He couldn't fight the system with violence. He couldn't fight it with money or political power. He didn't have those resources. But he had his story. He had his voice, he had his intelligence and his literacy and his determination to be heard. And he used those things to create something that would outlast slavery itself, a narrative that would become the template for an entire genre, a testimony that would help fuel the abolitionist movement. A voice that would echo through history saying, "I was enslaved and I survived and I'm telling you what it was really like and you can't ignore me." That's how you transform loss into power. You refuse to be silenced. You claim your story. You tell your truth, even when it's dangerous, even when it costs you, even when the system tries to erase you. You say, "I am here. I matter. My experience is real and important and needs to be heard." And you trust that somewhere, someone will listen. Someone will be changed. Someone will join the fight. William Grimes's transformation wasn't just personal. It was historical. He transformed himself from enslaved person to free man, to published author, to historical witness. But he also transformed American literature. He created a new genre. He gave voice to millions of enslaved people who couldn't tell their own stories. He provided evidence that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. He made slavery real for people who'd never seen it up close. And his transformation continues today. Every time someone reads his narrative, every time a historian references his work, every time a student learns about the first fugitive slave narrative, William Grimes is still speaking, still testifying, still refusing to be erased. His story is still changing minds, still opening hearts, still reminding us that transformation is possible even in the face of overwhelming injustice. The lessons from William's life come down to three essential truths. First, transformation requires using whatever power you have, even when it seems insufficient. William couldn't vote, couldn't hold office, couldn't change laws, but he could write, he could tell his story. And that story changed the world. Your voice, your testimony, your truth, it has power. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. Second, transformation requires community and partnership. William had Clarissa who stood by him. He had students from Litchfield Law School who assisted him. He had customers who supported his business. He had readers who bought his book. Nobody transforms alone. We need each other. We need people who believe in us, who support us, who amplify our voices. And third, transformation requires refusing to be erased. The system tried to reduce William to property, to a number in a ledger, to a nameless victim. And William said no. He wrote himself into history. He claimed his story. He created a record that would outlast slavery itself. That's the ultimate act of resistance and transformation, saying, I was here, I mattered, and you're going to remember me. William Grimes died in poverty, but he didn't die defeated. He died having lived a full life. He died having loved and been loved. He died having told his truth. He died having made a difference, and his legacy continues. His narrative is still read. His story is still told. His name is still remembered. The system tried to erase him, and it failed. He won. So here's what I want you to think about. What story are you not telling? What truth are you holding back because it feels too painful, too risky, too vulnerable? What transformation are you capable of that you haven't attempted because the obstacles seem too big, the system seems too powerful, the odds seem too long? William Grimes faced obstacles we can barely imagine. He was enslaved for 30 years. He was beaten, sold, separated from his family, forced to buy himself twice, robbed of everything he built. And he still transformed his life. He still told his story. He still made a difference. If he could do that, what's possible for you? Share your thoughts in the comments. What part of William's story resonates most with you? What transformation are you working toward in your own life? What obstacles are you facing, and how are you fighting back? Let's continue this conversation. Let's learn from each other. Let's support each other in our own journeys of transformation, because that's what William Grimes would want. Not for us to just admire his story, but to be inspired by it, to take action, to tell our own truths, to fight our own battles, to refuse to be erased, silenced, or defeated, to transform our lives and our world, one courageous choice at a time. William Grimes was born enslaved in 1784 and died free in 1865. In between, he lived a life of extraordinary courage, resilience, and determination. He escaped slavery, he built a business, he purchased his freedom twice, he wrote the first fugitive slave narrative in American history. He created a new literary genre. He helped fuel the abolitionist movement. He refused to be erased, and his story continues to inspire us today, more than 150 years after his death. That's the power of transformation. That's the power of refusing to give up. That's the power of telling your truth no matter the cost.